So happy you have joined us today. Welcome to After the Flood webinar. We've got a great lineup for you today. Very excited for you all to be here. My name is Rick Evans. I'm the Clean Energy Policy Specialist with the Groundwater Center for Resilient Communities. We have offices in Traverse City and Petoskey up here in beautiful northern Michigan. And really excited to be hosting this. Glad Peter reached out to us when we had this idea. Peter Sinclair, which you hear from a little bit, and really excited to be in the mix. I must say, I got to acknowledge there's so much going on in the world right now, obviously, and if we could just take a second to take a deep breath and kind of just be here, be present for each other and for this information. Just the fact that you're all here right now with as much going on tells me a lot. We've got a lot of great signups, and we are going to be recording this today as well. So we'll send this out to you as soon as we get wrapped. And with all these great challenges that we're dealing with, also comes a lot of great opportunities. And so a lot of the things we're covering today are not only the issues that are at hand, but then also solutions. We have just an amazing opportunity right now. Once in a lifetime, once in a generation opportunity between the pandemic and the transition to clean energy and everything happening right now, climate issues rearing its head and showing itself more and more. So we have a great lineup today to kind of walk through all of this and to get into some weeds of some of this and see where we can go, get some solutions and some dialogue going. And so quickly, just a couple of housekeeping items. We do have time for Q&A built into the end. So in the Q&A section there, if you could put your comments or questions there, we'll be scanning through those and answering those at the end. Not all the panelists will be able to join us at the end for the Q&A, but they will have their contact information so we can get a hold of everybody after the fact. And so we are aiming for an 11:30 end. But if we need to go a little long, we might be able to do that. But we are shooting to wrap up at 11:30 to respect all of your time. So all right, let's get into the good stuff here. Great lineup today, lots of important topics. And while we're focusing mostly on the Great Lakes region, this is certainly relevant across the country and even globe. Some of these issues have been largely ignored and marginalized for decades, even centuries. Systematic racism, environmental justice, climate change, just to name a few. And of course, with the major flooding events that happened here right in our backyards here recently that got so much national attention, we figured it would be a really good time to kind of bring all these things together and have a little dialogue and see where we can go from here. So let's learn this stuff and see if we can collectively figure out a different path to move on to. So very happy to be here with all these rock stars today. Huge shout out to Peter Sinclair for kind of brainstorming this whole thing. Justin Awanu, Healthy Communities and Environmental Justice Organizer with the Sierra Club. Dr. Dean Overpeck, Climate Scientist at the University of Michigan and Dean of the School for the Environment and Sustainability. And James Cliff, the Deputy Director for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And of course, Peter Sinclair, who is Yale Climate Connections videographer. He's got a long list, as does everyone. So I've known Peter for a long time and really looking to see and hear from him. So yeah, without further ado, Peter, if you could go ahead and take it away.
Very good. Okay, Rick, and I'll be sharing my screen in just a second. Just real quickly, as Rick has already given a great introduction, this last month's floods in mid-Michigan made me think of the old adage, never let a good crisis go to waste. So it's a great time to talk about the sort of collision moment that we have between climate change, aging infrastructure, and our need to upgrade our energy system globally. And I hope that those will be the topics for today. But I'm going to start out with a video. This is my most recent piece that I did for Yale Climate Connections. And I think it sort of frames things up and tells the story of where we're at right now to kick this conversation off. So with any luck here, I will be able to share screen. And very good. and we will start this right up. Just a moment.
Where climate change gets you most is when you take, say, a 150-year event and it suddenly becomes a 50-year event. And that's sort of what's happening in many places.
The atmosphere now in general has about 7% more moisture in it than it did back in, say, the 70s. There's very clear evidence that all across the United States, especially in the eastern half of the country, we've seen a big uptick. I mean, I'm talking 30, 40, 50% increase in the frequency of heavy precipitation events. This is very directly connected to climate change. It's totally expected, and it's certainly playing out in real time right before our very eyes.
So I grew up in a neighborhood called Meyerland in Houston, and when I was there, Meyerland never flooded. Now it floods all the time. And I went on Zillow, and I was looking at houses, and I found this beautiful house. It's 5,000 square feet. It's located in a nice neighborhood, good schools, and it's selling for $86 a square foot. It has a pool. I mean, it's really a beautiful house. And if you say, wow, why is it so cheap? It's because it's flooded twice. And so no one wants to buy this. No one wants to buy a house that's going to flood.
And the example I have in mind is Hurricane Harvey of 2017. And 3 independent groups who did not know about each other working on this, one of which was me, estimated that the risk of that level of rainfall in Harris County had more or less tripled between 1970 and 2017 when the event occurred.
And if you'll notice, it says would be a great candidate to lift. So I'll talk about that in a second.
It's going to rain harder on average, so you're going to see more of the type of rainfall events capable of causing extreme flooding.
The 500-year flood event, which are, of course, becoming more and more frequent. We've got climate change as a part of that, but also old infrastructure as well.
As far back as 1999, the feds warned that the dam needed to increase its capacity to prevent a significant flood from overcoming the structure.
And we have a lot of things that we've built that may be vulnerable to a gradual change, pushing them over a threshold and causing an abrupt issue for us.
Climate change is this constant pressure on our society, affecting millions of little decisions, affecting our lives in millions of ways, each one of them making us a little bit poorer than we would otherwise have to be. You know, if you live in the Gulf Coast, you're gonna have to run your air conditioner more. You're gonna have to pay for flood infrastructure. You're gonna have to pay to raise houses off the ground for new construction. There are just millions of these little costs that are going to be pushed into all of our lives.
You know, the average storm you might encounter every 10 years or so isn't changing very much, but the 100-year event is becoming noticeably, in many places, noticeably more risky.
A heavy rainfall event that would have occurred about once every 100 years on average in a world without human influence is now occurring about once every 20 years on average. And if we continue warming at 2 degrees of global warming from pre-industrial, that same precipitation event will be occurring about once every 5 years on average.
This is not any longer a problem about the future, it's a problem about now.
The entire swath of states from North Dakota to Michigan had their wettest year on record in 2019, and we had just amazing amounts of flooding.
Water vapor is energy. Think of it as energy. When that water vapor condenses into liquid, which happens in a cloud, that latent energy is released into the atmosphere, so that provides even more energy for the storm to work with. So when it does rain, it rains harder.
The danger of flash flooding is actually increasing, and it's not just because of heavier rains. It's also because of heavier real estate development.
It would have been called a 1,000-year flood if the same destructive deluge hadn't crashed through Ellicott City, Maryland just 2 years before.
Oh my God! You had two 1,000-year floods within 2 years of each other. How did that happen?
The overwhelming factor was intense rainstorms. More water is falling. On top of that, we're intensifying land use, which is clearing the natural vegetation and replacing it with impervious surfaces like concrete, asphalt, through which water does not penetrate.
So you know, I don't know who the owners are, but I know they've lost a lot of money. And so they've lost a lot of wealth. And this is a fundamental problem, this idea of what we call stranded assets. So you might own something. It might be an oil field, it might be a coal mine, it might be a house that floods. And then one day you wake up and it's not worth anything, or it's worth a lot less than you think. And that's a really socially destabilizing problem.
The first degree of warming doesn't cost very much. The next degree of warming costs a little more. The next degree of warming costs more than that one. The next degree of warming costs more than that one. What we face now is very small compared to what we could face if we keep burning all the fossil fuels we can get our hands on.
So I think that's a pretty good summary of where we are. And we have the message that I hope is getting through to people, that I think might be getting through to people in my town, is that climate change is not something that's just going to happen to people in Bangladesh or the Arctic or Africa. It's going to hit ordinary, everyday Americans pretty hard, and it is already starting to happen. So lots to talk about here. I'm going to, let's see, get off of my screen sharing here. You are now screen sharing. Stop share. There we go. Okay. So Rick, I'll let you take us to the next segment now.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, very powerful video. Those flooding images never cease to just to hit you in the gut. It's just amazing to see, and to put that on a national scale and a global scale, that's just happening, is crushing. And to think that we're just kind of beginning is something. So yes, if looks like we still have Peter up on the screen, but if yes, next if we can go to Justin up. Justin Onwenu, he's got it quite, for being such a young man, you have quite the resume already, my friend. And, you know, student body president at Rice University, currently inaugural appointee to Michigan's first advisory council for environmental justice by Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and currently the Healthy Communities and Environmental Justice organizer with the Sierra Club. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Justin Owana.
Well, thanks again for having me. And I was having a lot of memories and flashbacks from the first video. I started, just as an introduction to myself, I started getting involved in environmental justice work and climate work as a direct result of Hurricane Harvey. So like you mentioned, I went to school at Rice University, which is located in Houston. And a number of the communities, Meyerland, and the Houston area more broadly, was, you know, impacted tremendously. And some of the things that I remembered from that storm was just the images of going down a street that you would always go down, and to see everyone's belonging, just like, you know, what we're seeing in Midland, everyone's earthly belongings, from couches to photographs to microwaves, just everything that you can imagine, just on the front lawn. And I think that had a deep impact in moving me to think more broadly about climate, and also in thinking about environmental justice. So as you heard in the video, the storm was, the third 500-year storm in 5 years. The math on that just doesn't add up. And now what you're seeing in Houston is there's an entire industry that's propped up on simply lifting up people's homes, you know, because people aren't able to sell their homes. They're having to think of ways to get prepared for the next 500-year storm that could come in the next year or two. And so you're still seeing people trying to adapt to that. One of the other things that I noticed from the storm, so after graduating, I worked for the Children's Environmental Health Initiative, which used to be located at University of Michigan and moved to Rice. But one of the things that we were trying to do was uncover the long-term health impact of the storm. And so we went to neighborhoods throughout the Houston area and asked folks, what was your health like before the storm? What is it now? Did your car experience flooding? Did your home experience flooding? I met many families who still had mold in their homes over a year after the storm. People who had to move, their kids from their bedrooms to the living room because mold had overtaken the bedroom. And so as we talk about flooding and climate resiliency, I always think it's important to think about the communities, the types of people who aren't able to move, who don't have the money to, even do things like remediate their homes after a storm. And so in the aftermath of the storm that kind of moved me to action, Hurricane Harvey, what was observed was Superfund sites were flooded, companies required to do air monitoring and other types of monitoring mysteriously stopped doing that monitoring. And there were a lot of different health impacts observed, from respiratory issues associated with mold to a lot of other health impacts that we're still seeing today. And the last thing I'll mention about the storm in Houston is that the response to a storm that cost $125 billion, the most costly in America by some estimates, was a $2.5 billion bond for flood infrastructure that Harris County residents passed by over 80%. So you have a $125 billion storm, and the response is $2.5 billion in bond for flood infrastructure. Ignoring the ways that we could, create more green spaces to soak up a lot of water, ignoring the mismatch in scale. The number one question I ask myself with that is, are we thinking about things on the scale that we need to? And I don't think we are, when you consider how often this has happened. So fast forward, now that I'm in Detroit working as an environmental justice organizer with the Sierra Club, you wouldn't expect flooding to be, an issue that's on the top of people's minds or something that people are experiencing just based on the national conversation. But we've seen coastal erosion. You all will probably recall that there's a notable political donor that essentially told lawmakers he would stop making donations if they didn't fix the issue of coastal erosion because his homes on Lake Michigan were at risk. But you're also seeing in Detroit, along the riverfront, Belle Isle, which is along the riverfront, has tremendous flooding issues. We have an industrial riverfront, so we're seeing sites like the Revere Dock site that collapsed in late 2019 into the river. There were a lot of concerns about PCB and other forms of contamination falling into the river, which supplies water for millions of people. So there are a lot of concerns about that, and I think it's raised the issue of flooding and climate resiliency to the top of people's minds, in addition to all the other things that people are thinking about. So the response, I'll talk a little bit about the response to the collapse of the contaminated site into the Detroit River, and how I think it may provide kind of a path forward for us in thinking about flood infrastructure and flood response, especially in southeastern Michigan. So one of the ways that we responded, so for those who don't know, there was a contaminated site. It collapsed into the Detroit River. It took a week for a Canadian newspaper to report that a site that was formerly used for the Manhattan Project, there were a lot of concerns that it had contamination, was posing a risk to the river and to our drinking water supply. And so again, a week after the collapse incident happened, there was an article that came out from a Canadian newspaper that prompted local lawmakers on the city, state, and federal level to respond. And so as a result of, a lot of citizens who were caught off guard, a lot of concern, a lot of confusion, the concerns that we've raised up have to do with prevention. So making sure that incidents, so we don't have industrial sites collapsing into the Detroit River anymore. So thinking about how do we make sure that companies along the river are regularly inspected, so their seawall is regularly inspected? How do we make sure that the piles of aggregate that are stored along the Detroit River, especially as water levels rise, are actually set back at a level that's far enough so that they're not posing a risk to the river, and requiring a number of other public disclosures are things that we're thinking about. We're also thinking about just protection more broadly. So how do we protect the Great Lakes from incidents like this? How do we make sure that drinking water is protected and that people have faith that drinking water is protected when these sorts of emergency situations happen? And more broadly, how do we make sure that our emergency protocols are streamlined and efficient enough so that even if there isn't something that's gone wrong, people have confidence in the aftermath of an event like this, that things are okay. And then lastly, accountability. There have been a lot of bad actors, and this is something that I'm sure will be talked about as we talk about, what happened in Midland. But there's a conversation that I think needs to be had about corporate accountability. We've systematically, of course, at the governmental level, disinvested in water infrastructure. But there are also a lot of companies that are either located along our waterways or that are in charge of protecting and maintaining upkeep for water infrastructure who simply haven't done that. And making sure that we have a culture of accountability is important so that, as these events become more common, we're decreasing our likelihood of catastrophic events like we've seen, in our state a number of times. I'll also mention in Detroit, we've seen flooding in the Jefferson-Chalmers neighborhood on the east side of Detroit, where sandbags and cleaning up storm drains are the response to that flooding. And again, I want to challenge us to think about meeting the challenge, which is consistent flooding every year, 500-year storms every year, it seems like. We need to think about if sandbags and cleaning out storm drains is meeting that challenge at that scale, and I don't think that it is. So I think the number one thing moving forward that we should think about is investment in water infrastructure, of course, so that includes resiliency, but it also includes just water infrastructure more broadly. And then also, just as an environmental justice organizer, I think when we have the conversation about climate and about mitigating and preventing these sorts of climate catastrophes from happening, we need to make sure that the solutions that we're proposing aren't putting, an undue burden on communities that have already been burdened. So that means, rejecting frameworks that puts pollution in one area, carbon offsets, for example, and other solutions that put burden on environmental justice communities, even though overall reductions may be going down. I think we need to, as we talk about climate, think about cumulative impact. So multi-source pollution, and thinking about the types of communities where pollution is concentrated, pollution in those areas and emissions in those areas, in my mind, needs to be addressed and needs to be reduced first. So those are the number one things I'm thinking about moving forward is just water infrastructure investment. How do we change the conversation about scale? And then also making sure that communities that have been, placed undue burden aren't burdened moving forward as we take action on climate. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Justin. Yes, appreciate your insights. Yeah, we have our work cut out for us. As you hit the head so well. It is frustrating to think that we have all these issues and all we do we rebuild in the same floodplains and to the same degree, to the same capacities. And it's time to take a step back. And I think hopefully one of the takeaways that we can take back from today is just of going back to our communities and revisiting our community planning, our long range planning. And when we have these areas, like, okay, where are these floodings consistently happening? Maybe we should stop building damn houses there. Maybe we should, how do we mitigate these water issues much more appropriately and smartly, realizing this is going to be a long-term issue into the future. It's not just a thing right now, a one-off storm. And so as soon as we start embracing that bigger picture, longer term, I think we can come to some better solutions. So So thank you, Justin, for that. Moving on here, Dr. Dean Overpeck. He basically needs no introduction. I'm very happy to have him today. Definitely his years of experience and knowledge on climate science is quite impressive. Over 210 published works on climate and the environmental sciences. Works as a working group 1 coordinating lead author for the Nobel Prize winning IPCC 4th assessment in 2007, and also in the working group 2 lead author for the IPCC 5th assessment. So yeah, very excited to have him today with us. And with that, Dr. Overpeck, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Rick. And really appreciated Justin's conversation just a second ago, as well as Peter's video, highlighting a couple things that I'll try and highlight as well, talking about the hydrologic cycle and how it's raining a lot more and a lot harder, but also how the climate change is intersecting with environmental social injustice in this country. And it's when these things come together, it makes a bigger problem that really highlights how important it is for us to solve them at the same time, rather than trying to solve one only to have the other one, like whack-a-mole, pop up and get worse. So I'm wearing a t-shirt, which is rare for me to give a talk. I might have not done this in a long time, but this is a March for Science t-shirt. You can see it there, from an old Earth Day. And I think one of the things that the pandemic is really making clear to us is that we have to listen to science. If we don't listen to science, people literally die. So when it comes to climate change, we've got the same problem going on. So what I'm going to do is switch over now to my presentation here, which is a short presentation, share my screen. Let's see if this works. I take it everyone can see this? Someone say yes. And what I'm going to do is wait for my computer to be able to respond, which we've discovered. Hang on just a sec. I'm going to have it. Okay. It doesn't want to. The same thing happened during our practice, and it went away eventually. There we go. So climate change, I want everyone to realize two things that are central to this talk. And we're going to talk about injustice. We're going to talk about hydrologic change that we're getting in Michigan. It's obvious. It's collapsing dams. It's flooding out Detroit. It's making it impossible for farmers to farm. But notwithstanding that, we have a major opportunity in Michigan. I want to go through that first, because what we're really worried about in Michigan are, what can bring people together? What can we, across the political spectrum, work together on? And one of them, of course, is pure Great Lakes. One of them is clean drinking water. Another is a good economy. These are all things that the polls say Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals alike want. So the climate opportunity is something that's important for us to realize. And that is that right now, even though we're starting to get the effects of climate change, we're better off than many other parts of the country. Justin was talking, and the video was talking about what's going on in Houston and Texas along the coast with these unusually large tropical storms, hurricanes, dumping way more water than they used to. Paradoxically, out in the Southwest United States, where I came from 3 years ago, they're getting into an increasingly acute water crisis, not enough water, because the Colorado River, which serves all the major cities of the Southwest, including San Diego and LA, has declined its flows by about 20%. And much of that is due to the warming, due to climate change. And we're pumping groundwater out there that's non-renewable, as we'll see in a minute. So they're running out of water. Along the coast, there's too much water. But let's just stick to the relative climate change impacts in the United States and think about where we are in Michigan, particularly on a day like today, which in much of Michigan is pretty much beautiful summer day. Out in Tucson, my former city, where I lived 20 years, this is the view I would have gotten out my back porch if I was still there. The mountains north of town are just totally on fire. Uncontrolled wildfire. This is happening across the West increasingly. I have a cabin up in Colorado. The fires seem to seek me out, I guess. At one time, there were 2 fires dumping ash on my cabin, this being one of them. And what's important about the fires isn't that my cabin was being affected or my former hometown, but more that with these wildfires, the problem is that the West is aridifying, meaning it's not just the water supply. It means soils are drying out, the forests are drying out. That's making it much easier for them to burn. When you get a big event like this in California, of course, many people died. Tens of thousands of dwellings were destroyed in one community in one fire. And these are becoming more common. But there's also this air pollution problem. And this gets at some of the injustice that's going on, is that in the cities like Detroit, there's too much air pollution. I'll come back to this in a second. But the same thing's happening out west, both due to burning of fossil fuel, but now wildfires are producing as much particulate matter as the burning of fossil fuels. So climate change is affecting human health. And of course, that's affecting some populations, poorer populations, disadvantaged populations, disproportionately. And this is this systemic injustice that exists in our country, that wherever we have a problem like climate change makes it worse for some populations and some of our fellow citizens. And of course, there's embedded racism in this. And that's why we have to tackle these problems together. Why is the West drying up? Why are we getting more burning? Everyone on this call I know knows the answer. Some of you have heard me say it before, but it's pretty crystal clear what's going on. The planet is warming up. It's literally baking as we warm the temperatures. And it's, in some cases, reducing water supply. In other cases, it's burning. And paradoxically, in other places, it's flooding. And we'll talk more about that in a sec. Okay? But before I get to the flooding, I want to just highlight one other aspect of this water shortage problem that is growing in the United States. It's not just climate change. It's the fact that we humans are smart, or so we think, and we're trying to find ways to become resilient in the face of declining precipitation and river flows, for example. What do? We pump groundwater, and this groundwater is all across our country, some places more than others. These are in color here on this slide are the big aquifers or underwater lakes of water that have been studied. And what's interesting about all of these aquifers across the United States that have been studied, all the big ones, they're all declining, meaning they're being depleted. What's happened is that these aquifers fill up over tens and hundreds of thousands of years with beautiful, pristine water, and then we pump it out in just a matter of years. And it isn't sustainable because it can't recharge fast enough. And I highlight, one of the one that's really supporting Arizona now down there. You can see the big aquifer there, or in California in the Central Valley. But look on the high plains that are the breadbasket for the United States. Sure, we can grow things here in Michigan and Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, but increasingly we're using groundwater to do it, and that groundwater will run out. What happens when it runs out? Again, it's not all about running out of water. You're on the coast. You're not only getting these supercharged hurricanes, which get stronger as the sea surface or ocean temperatures warm, that can dump more rainfall because the atmosphere can hold more moisture. As Jennifer Francis said in Peter's video, 7% more moisture per degree C warming. That means when it rains, it can rain a lot harder. Okay, but you got that combined with sea level rise. The sea level rise that's due to the fact that the ocean is expanding as it warms up, like a hot air balloon, like a hot air balloon, or that the big ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica are starting to fall apart. And this is raising the ocean levels all over the planet. And here you can just see some of the areas that are going to be flooded in this century in the darkest colors. So New Orleans will be pretty much flooded out in this century. But many other cities like Miami, Tampa, Jacksonville, Palm Beach, Virginia Beach, Houston. These are all going to have a real big problem with seawater coming in. Just at the same time, they'll have more big hurricanes dumping more and more rain and bringing in a big storm surge. So the big question is, to many Americans, is where do you want to live? Where do you want to start your business? Where do you want to flourish? That's what we all are trying to do, is flourish. This is another study that was published in the journal Science just a couple of years ago. And they did not look at sea level rise, but they did look at the cost of coastal storms and a number of other factors. They did not look at the water shortages that are building over the United States. So those are two big things: the sea level rise and the water shortages, which aren't even factored in here. And you can see in red the parts of the country that they estimate will have big decreases in economic output, or GDP, at the county level. And you can see right away that if you're living on the coast of Texas or Florida or South Carolina, Virginia, North Carolina, any of those places, it's not just the sea level rise that's sort of lapping at your front door. It's a lot of other problems that are further inland as well. So where are you going to move? Or are you just going to stay put and absorb these losses? Or as in the video, it was Andy Dexler pointed out, these stranded assets. Where are you going to move? You're going to move to New York or the Bay Area? No, it's too expensive. Boston? No, too expensive. DC? No, can't afford it. So you start looking at places like Michigan. And that's our big advantage. Right now, our climate change is less dramatic than it is in many parts of the world and in the United States. We also have 20% of the world's unfrozen fresh water. And if you've been listening to my talk so far, you can see that fresh water is going to get more and more valuable and important as we deplete all the other drinkable and useful groundwater and river water. That's just literally being vaporized by climate change in some cases. So it's not as if we're going to say, invite everyone to Michigan to use up all our water. The question is, how are we going to do it intelligently? How are we going to listen to people like Justin and make sure that we remove the sources of contamination or pollution, get them away from our water bodies, because the water is going to get more and more valuable to our livelihoods. Just in the news, the Line 5 pipeline going underneath Lake Michigan and Huron up north, we found out it's more damage than we thought. We got to get that shut down, or else we're going to end up having oil spills in the Great Lakes. These are the kind of things we have to start thinking about, because we have a really valuable part of the country that could fuel economic revitalization, sustainable, just revitalization in our region. But if you've been listening to Justin, you've been listening to Peter's video, we have a challenge. And everybody in Michigan, I think, is starting to realize this. And the dam burst up in Midland really highlighted what that challenge is. The floods in Detroit really highlight what that is. If you're out on a farm, you know what we're talking about. You haven't been able to plant some years because the soils are too wet. So let's just first look at temperature. Obviously, our temperatures are going up. Just a couple weeks ago, or was it last week? It seems things are pretty darn hot. Traverse City's had multiple days above 90 degrees already this year. I like going up there to get away from the heat, but it's hot up there too. Well, that's nothing compared to what we'll get if we allow greenhouse gas emissions to continue, if we continue to burn fossil fuels, if we fail to turn to renewable energy. Because by the end of the century, if we just keep going the way we're going, we'll have temperatures that are about 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than now in every month of the year. But that translates in the summer to 40 or more days above 100 degrees C in Michigan. Can you imagine that? I lived in Tucson. It was a dry heat. I'll tell you, 100 degrees, as everyone in the Zoom knows, in Michigan is not a dry heat. It's miserable. We do not want that. Obviously, that would turn people away from our part of the world. Here's the slide that was in Peter's video that Jennifer Francis was showing on the right. And it shows the percentage, those little circles with numbers, the percentage increase in the heaviest rainfall, meaning the heaviest 1% storms. They're becoming much more frequent, and the drizzle storms are becoming less frequent. Now, I know you never believe that living in Michigan, because we get a lot of drizzle too. But this is where the floods that break dams, that flood out neighborhoods in Detroit, that prevent farmers from farming. This is part of that problem. But it's another aspect of this is just that the average precipitation, this is the graph on the left, is also going up. And again, all of this was predicted by climate scientists. You listened to science, you knew this was going to happen. But what we didn't know is how fast it would happen. the increase in the heaviest precipitation is coming much faster than we thought. Just as the warming, say, of the Arctic, you've probably been hearing of 100 degrees up in Siberia, northern Siberia. No climate scientist thought we'd have that this fast. So it's really getting to be eye-opening and alarming what's going on. When that rainfall hits, it doesn't just hurt communities. It also floods a lot more nutrients from our farms, and Ohio's farms, into Lake Erie, for example. And that's where we get the harmful algal blooms, toxic algae blooms, that we now know this toxic algae gets airborne. That's new news. We also now know that we're starting to get more algal blooms in the other parts of the Great Lakes. So if we want more algae and we want to have shorelines and beaches like we have in Lake Erie, all over the Great Lakes, just let it happen, because that algae loves flushed in nutrients, higher rainfall, and it loves warmer temperatures. And obviously that's putting our infrastructure at risk. When I first used this slide, it was before the dam broke. Now we all know what we're talking about. Again, we're warned. Scientists said this was going to happen. It's happening. Paradoxically, because the atmosphere can hold more moisture, when it isn't raining, it's going to be demanding more moisture from the surface, whether it's a lake, a river, or a forest or a farm. And that's going to dry things out more too. So this is already what's happening out west with the uptick in wildfire. This is already happening. You probably read about it in North Dakota, South Dakota with flash drought. Just a matter of time before we get more wildfire and flash drought going in Michigan. You know, the dry spell in Michigan that we always talk about in the middle of the summer, we can get through because we have groundwater or because it's not that long. Well, these dry spells are going to get hotter and drier, and pretty soon we're going to have to irrigate to get through them, and pretty soon we'll start using up our groundwater as well. So we got some problems ahead if we let climate change continue. If we stop the climate change, we're a climate change winner. And health. The pandemic is really exposing what's going on with ignorance of public health. You know, people are dying in increasing numbers in my old state of Arizona, Texas now, Florida. It's going crazy. We're lucky in Michigan that we all banded together and listened to the science, stayed at home, really dropped those numbers down. But there are other threats as well that will be exacerbated by climate change. Those include infectious diseases, the mosquitoes, the Lyme disease. They also include heat waves. And this is another area where the injustice is going to hit. Mark my words, Tony Reams, one of my colleagues in my school for environment and sustainability, works in Detroit, was highlighting how this summer is going to be rough because we're going to get the heat wave and not everyone in Detroit can afford the electricity to have the air conditioning they need. So this is why we're probably going to see some pretty scary times again, and it'll interact with the pandemic. Speaking of interacting with the pandemic, one of the things we learned besides listen to science is that air pollution is one of the things that makes your risk of coronavirus mortality much higher. Air pollution comes from the burning of fossil fuels, the dominant source. It turns out, of course, that air pollution is connected to the same cause as climate change. So one of the bonuses we get in Michigan, if we choose to reduce our fossil fuel burning and go to renewable energy, is we get a reduction in air pollution and an increase in air quality. We actually saw this happening with the pandemic. When the economy slowed down, our air cleaned up. So we know it's going to happen. And we also know that air quality kills outright. And you can see on this map, I really wanted to show this map because it shows in red, in orange, yellow, where we have air pollution problems in the United States. Southern Michigan is really plagued with this, and this is one of the reasons Detroit and the populations there got hit so hard, because people in Detroit have been unfairly co-located with roads and highways and air pollution from cars, as well as industrial pollution. This is the systemic racism that led to that. It led directly then to greater mortality rates in our cities, and not just Detroit, but elsewhere as well. This is what we have to get rid of, folks. We got to solve the climate crisis in a way that everyone benefits, where the world that we have in the end is one without the environmental injustice. So if we do all of this, we're in good shape. If we don't embrace renewable energy, it's going to be really hard to just adapt to the changes that will be occurring. I haven't even talked about the lake levels in the Great Lakes and what they're doing. Higher variability, we don't like that. But we could be a big winner if we embrace renewable energy. We could be a big loser like everyone else if we don't. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. And if we have time for questions at the end, that'll be great. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Overpeck. Yeah, great information. And actually, speaking of the Q&A, I appreciate you bringing that up. And if people do have questions, if you can put those in the Q&A, we will be going over those. We've got a few in there, but we could definitely use a few more. So if folks would like to ask anything, just click on that box. You can ask there. One of the things that triggered in my mind is in just these systems redesign, and something that William McDonough, I heard present many years ago, that brought up, and just designing keeping these systems where you have keeping the biological nutrients in one system and keeping the technical nutrients in another system. As long as those two sets of nutrients are kept in their own camps, everything's fine. It's when those technical nutrients and the biological nutrients wind up overlapping that we wind up having these toxicity issues, and and water, they overlap with that, because water is, of course, the great the mixer of all these things of what we need to be clean and all these technical nutrients. So water issues are going to be tremendously important moving forward. So thank you for all of that. So we'd like to bring Peter Sinclair back for another video. And he's got one kind of a little more related to these direct things here. And Peter, I guess if you could go ahead and take it away.
Great, thanks. So I first met Justin in Detroit in November on the occasion of a visit from Aaron Mayer, who is the first African-American president of the Sierra Club, who made a swing through Michigan, speaking in Grand Rapids, Detroit, and Flint. And I was following him and eventually putting together a video of his very powerful message. And a lot of the things that he was talking about then were certainly germane, and they were certainly important. I have to say that in listening at that time, I thought, well, this is all very good, but it seems almost too optimistic and too aspirational, that maybe we can't do all of these things that we need to do. But now, precisely because of this global pandemic and the economic crisis, things that may have seemed radical 8 months ago now seem very much on the table, and in fact quite reasonable. We're going to be doing a lot of rebuilding as we come out of this COVID crisis and the economic downturn that we're in. So we have to start thinking now, and that's one of the major motivators behind this presentation, is to get us all to start thinking in terms of what it's going to be like as we come out of this. So a lot of very important things on the table. So I've got a video here that I made, as I said, on behalf of the Sierra Club, of Aaron Mayer's talk, and I will share screen now and see if we can get my computer to catch up, and I will play that.
If you have to throw a dart and begin your fight for the Green New Deal, where do you go? The Rust Belt. I asked the fundamental, why do they call it Rust Belt? Well, because that's where the industrial capacity, the powerhouse of America, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, the powerhouse states that built stuff. Now think about it. It was the New Deal that built the American middle class. The GI Bill, you could buy a home. How many dads and moms got their law degree or business degrees from that GI Bill? We're coming full circle back to what really built the middle class and built power. With the Green New Deal, is we're building that same vision, okay, of FDR and Eisenhower, and instead of it just being thrown at industry, we're throwing it at what we need to do to save the planet. We have a degraded environment because the 1% know that everybody is struggling to get by or survive or have a decent living. So that wage is important. And when that wage is taken away, they know that people are willing to do a lot more just to get that dollar. In some cases, they give away their health. Think of lying, look at a coal worker.
Years of working in a dark Kentucky coal mine have taken its toll on John Robinson.
Feel to be pretty important, coal miners are, but they just ain't being done right. And they're being robbed, really are, they're being robbed.
Just a block, not a city street, where you had 12 people die from cancer and 3 or 4 people still on the block living with cancer.
My daughters ended up with environmental asthma. And as a father whose children were injured, that's what pulled me into the environmental movement. Crime, bullets, all those things that we see striking the urban black community or even the rural communities in white America and rural America. That's right. It's the lack of economic opportunity.
We're in this hamster wheel in Southeast Michigan where we pay a healthcare bill and then we maybe skip a DTE bill and we'll pay a water bill and then we'll pay the mortgage. And a lot of people are doing that, right? A lot of people are switching out what they have to pay for something else. Since 2014, the household burden, that swapping back and forth, has doubled and tripled for working poor families.
The residents who have been here, born here, they do feel left out. They have been hearing for years the trickle-down effect. We'll create it at the top and it'll trickle down. Well, they're waiting for their time.
And how they get away with that gain is then they start blaming other people, immigrants and others who are coming in, as they say, that's competing against you, and that's why you're not being paid as much, or that's not why your community doesn't have the service, because we have to pay for all these other people. So everybody thinks the environmental justice movement is environmental for black folks or brown folks. No, it is not. It's like the civil rights, it's for all folks. It's the right of humanity to clean air, clean water, and clean soil. The most important threat is anthropogenic climate change. The old model, the New Deal model, was predicated on economic expansion, so we built a lot of cars, we built a lot of factories, coal-powered factories, we built refineries, we built all that stuff, and now we come to pay the bill that all that energy and that opportunity is now costing us our planet. So now we have to do that big government organizing, just as it built the middle class and built the industrial powerhouse that was America, that also once built Detroit. We now have to turn that power to now save the planet. We can build and do anything. It was labor in this Motor City that beat back the fascists during World War II. It was the Motor City that fueled the economic engine that drove and built America. And this is where ground zero, it has to begin. Visioning is up to you. The sky is the limit if you vision it. If you're waiting for the 1% to give you a miracle and give you that legislation, it'll be a wait in vain. And by that time, the planet will be at beyond the tipping point, and our next generations will not ever even have the opportunity to dream or share this vision. Living wages and living jobs on a living planet. These things must be intersectional. And we must transcend those barriers that keep us apart, but come together to be that voice, to say, this is what we want.
So powerful words from Mr. Mayor. And my own work over the last several years has been in helping to spread the message about the need for renewable energy and taking that message mostly across rural Michigan, where economies are just as hard pressed as they are in some of our urban areas. And the message is that there's tremendous opportunity here that people are waking up to. In fact, right now, as we've got economies, communities all over the state where the economy is flat on their back, we have a number of large shovel-ready renewable energy projects. Some of them already in motion, some of them just waiting for some permitting process. But these things are ready to go to begin to help us dig out of this this financial hole, this once-in-a-century downturn that we're in. But we've all got to kind of get behind it and get the policies in place to make this change happen, and then also being aware of the climate change that is already upon us. We have to start rebuilding and hardening our infrastructure so that we don't get hit even worse in the future than we have in recent months. So I know that our next speaker is probably going to have something to say on some of those issues. So Rick, go ahead and make that introduction, and I will stop my share here.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Peter. And yes, next, it's my pleasure to introduce James Clift. He's the Deputy Director at the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And James has spent decades as an environmental policy leader in Michigan, and before joining EGLE, I worked for many years as the policy director at the Michigan Environmental Council. So thanks for joining us today, James.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to kind of zip through some of my talks here because I'm really interested in getting to the questions and answers and talking to some of the people that joined us this morning. But I mean, I think you started by talking about taking a breath, and we've been trying to do that and think, okay, here we are in 2020, 50 years since the anniversary of Earth Day, 50 years since the passage of the Michigan Environmental Protection Act. And we've been going back to that one a little bit more and more under the Whitmer administration, because I really think it asks the key question, which is, is there a feasible and prudent alternative to what we're doing today? Is there another path? And how do we keep making sure that we keep asking that question and looking for that path that leads to kind of a brighter future? I think that's really important. The governor obviously deeply committed to the climate issue. I can tell you that she looks forward to the day that she doesn't have to think about COVID-19 and how to get the state kind of through this pandemic. Unfortunately, she doesn't control that timeline. The virus does. But I think we'll continue to see her kind of try to champion this issue kind of moving forward. I think and what I like about kind of some of the conversations that we're kind of starting at the state is the fact that even kind of before recent events, the environmental justice equity overlay was already being kind of laid there through, the establishment of the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice under Regina Strong, the task force on racial disparities being headed up by the Lieutenant Governor, Garland Gilchrist. I think these efforts are making sure that as we have these conversations, we're trying to get the right people, at the table moving forward. So, what has COVID meant to Michigan? Because I think as we start to talk about solutions and where the state is trying to kind of play a positive role, we need to be realistic about kind of where we are. I'm sure many people saw in the media this week the reports about job losses in the clean energy sector. Michigan, that's about 30,000 jobs, over the last couple of months have been lost in the clean energy sector. If you really kind of dice through those, about 2/3 of those are in the energy efficiency world. The ones that were trying to get us to be more efficient with the energy that we used. So we'll be looking carefully. A lot of the jobs, of course, that have been lost, and there has been a lot. I mean, I think in Michigan, we're up to about 1 million people have filed for unemployment. The economic forecast we have right now is that, by the end of the year, we're probably still going to be in almost 500,000 people will have lost their job in Michigan. We'll maybe get half of those back next year. But I think the key here is hopefully trying to assist in making sure that as many of those clean energy jobs as possible, get back to work and are helped in one way, shape, or form. We're watching very closely discussions in Washington on the potential of a federal stimulus bill, and hoping that clean energy will be a big part of that. So we're trying to kind of get ready for that. If you look at the economics in Michigan, of course, the predictions are between this year and next year, we got about a $6 billion hole in our budget. Putting that in contrast to 2008, 2010, kind of the most recent kind of recessionary downturn, that's about twice as big as hole as we saw in 2008. So that's going to hamper things a little bit because that's revenue the state doesn't have. Revenue we do have right now, especially in the clean energy world, we're focused on, what can we do to help local units of government? What can we do to help them build the expertise within their city government to deal with climate change and help be a great partner in moving forward with reducing kind of energy use and hopefully building kind of renewable projects within their cities. How do we make sure that we line up financing for them so when they have those shovel-ready projects, we've got some financing mechanism ready for them. We've been looking at kind of some training opportunities for them. Again, we think it's going to be very important. They've been really some of the leaders with the lack of kind of national leadership on this issue. It really has been the states and the cities and small units of government who have been stepping up and have really been kind of the voice of trying to move forward on climate issues across this country. So trying to line up and making sure that, again, hopefully we'll get some support from the federal government, but what the money we do have kind of focused a lot of that in that area. The other area we are looking at too is agriculture. They've had a couple of rough years trying to figure out how to get them more energy efficient in their operations. I would say the next biggest kind of issue that we've been working on is the question of mobility. Now that transportation has taken over as the #1, contributor to climate change and carbon emissions, the key is how quickly can we start, getting this discussion on mobility, moving forward? How do we make it automated? How do you kind of the shared transportation environment? How do we stay connected? How do we electrify that system? Michigan's history in kind of the auto manufacturing, sector, I think makes us important players here. I think making sure that, our infrastructure is ready. We're getting there, not there yet, but we're starting to build out the infrastructure, for those electrical vehicles of the future. The research and development kind of critical, especially on when you start to move toward the, autonomous vehicle end of the spectrum. I've been thinking in this last week of how unproductive this cycle we're in is. We hit into a something like COVID or even the last recession, and whenever our economy turns down, all of a sudden oil prices go with it. So you see oil prices plunge at the same time, which is not helpful in this area, of course. And to me, kind of that opportunity where, geez, what if you were collecting the revenue off the carbon there, and that was being kind of repositioned into helping the economy becoming less dependent on those fossil fuels. I don't think people would have noticed if price of gas went down to $2.50 instead of $2, and the amount of money you could generate kind of moving forward if you were ready to kind of capture that revenue stream. Unfortunately, not a discussion that has went far in Lansing. But kind of going back to where I started, what are those feasible and prudent alternatives? And we're starting to really look across the different places where government makes decisions. We do a lot of work, of course, in energy planning, integrated resource plans out of our major investor-owned utilities, making sure that we're applying to MEPA to those decisions. Could the major utilities be investing their dollars in a different way in the future that would help kind of reduce that long-term use of fossil fuel? We mentioned the air pollution issues in Southeast Michigan and across the state. We, of course, we're in non-attainment for ozone, ground level ozone. That's clearly one of these issues that can be driven by those extreme heat days. Tends to be the same days you'll hear kind of ozone action days, That's those periods where clearly damage is happening to public health. How can we kind of apply that thinking of what is the feasible and prudent alternatives to those emissions that are contributing to those ozone kind of exceedances that we can start to put in place at the state government level at this point. And lastly, kind of getting back to that, making sure that we're always keeping that equity lens focused. As we look at making these investments, how do we make sure that everybody in Michigan is participating in the investments we're making and in the programs we're kind of designing, kind of going forward? I think one of the things that the latest COVID thing has shown, Michigan, of course, was, I think, the only state in the country requiring the reconnection of water service to homes that didn't have water. Over 2,000 homes in Michigan were reconnected to water. They were occupied homes that people didn't even have water. You hear stories about when the utilities got there. Unfortunately, the infrastructure within the home was such that it needed significant work just to be able to kind of handle water service. So fortunately, the legislature did kind of move $25 million into kind of water assistance moving forward for the rest of the year. One of our goals is we've hooked these people back up to water. How do we keep them hooked up? But I think it's getting us thinking about how do we run these various programs, and you think about energy assistance, how much do you help people pay the bill, which is important, or how do you get in there and weatherize their home so their bills are less every month, into the future? How do we both get the benefit of reduced fossil fuel use and a home that can better afford to pay for basic services for their family? And trying to make sure that we're kind of viewing them with that lens kind of moving forward. I think I'll pause there. I think let's stop there and get into some of the questions and answers questions we might have this morning. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak today.
Yes, thank you for that, James. Yeah, a lot of great points. And I guess we got a lot of great questions. And obviously we have a lot of topical, everything from water, flooding, energy infrastructure, climate. So there's a lot of overlapping issues and a lot of great questions. And I guess, James, just to kind of build a little bit on your last points there, I used to be an energy auditor for 15 years or so, and we've been talking about that forever. It said, look, instead of with a lot of these assistance programs, you're just giving money away that's gone. It's not making any long-term improvements. So that coupled with what you brought up with, the state losing a lot of infrastructure dollars and just revenue right now. So some of the things that Peter and I have talked about in the past that maybe you could all comment on is the tax revenue from clean energy projects that could then be turned back into those local communities as a resource for not only, other building roads, helping out schools, providing food assistance. There's all kinds of opportunities and need right now in these communities. And are there shovel-ready projects that you think could happen, that could be implemented to get those tax revenues going in a somewhat short period of time? And do you see state lands being able to be utilized for renewable energy development?
Yes, I'll start quickly, then others jump in. I know the Department of Natural Resources have been looking a lot. They're one of the major kind of landowners on behalf of the state of Michigan. So they're looking at kind of their portfolio of land and saying, okay, where might we be able to kind of offer that up to developers to kind of create that opportunity for renewable projects. One thing the administration did early is got into PA 116, the Farmland Preservation Act, because farmers kind of had land that was sitting vacant, and people started to ask the question, well, could we use that for like solar development? But there was kind of impediments within that program. So made the decision that the answer was going to be yes. We were going to allow that to be used for renewable energy, and then just the land still preserved. So at the end of a project, once it was removed, that land would still be available for agricultural use in the future, kind of if necessary. But again, I'll let others kind of chip in. I know that when you get into kind of renewable energy and how quickly are we getting them into the mainstream, you get issues of interconnection. You've got the MISO-Q, which is the Regional Transmission Authority, and how projects kind of get put online. I think we're all seeing the utilities move in the right direction. We just wish it was happening a little faster.
Rick, I'd like to jump in a little bit on that. You mentioned the tax revenue for local communities, and one of the beauties of the renewable wind and solar development that we're seeing is that there is a really substantial tax stream that these local communities are tapping into, and it's doing amazing things for schools, for their ability to maintain and upgrade roads, fire rescue, road patrols, senior services, libraries, you name it, right on down the line. So it's a whole new model for much needed development in the rural areas. The question that I have for James is, we mentioned upgrading dwellings and buildings and businesses for energy efficiency, and it seems to me that that's potentially a huge job creator in rural and urban areas that could employ people right from very low skill all the way up to very high skill trades level, and get started pretty quickly. Is that something that the state has any latitude to create, or do we have to wait on federal funding for that, or what are our options there, and what's our best bang for the buck?
I mean, we have some funds available, and we're trying to move them into that area, but we really are seeing that energy efficiency space is probably kind of the most valuable money we could be spending. You know, Michigan, we don't have a lot of new housing starts. We're not building a lot of new buildings. So retrofitting the existing building stock is going to be necessary to hit our climate goals. So I think across the board, we see that as good investments, and it makes the businesses and or families in Michigan kind of more economically sound moving forward. So you get wins across the board, you create the jobs. So we are definitely seeing that as kind of one of the #1 areas, is kind of trying to increase the commitment to energy efficiency spending within the state.
Is there a specific program that people can access, and how are people in some of these impacted areas going to find out about that?
Yeah, so there are some existing programs. I don't want to take up too much time there. We got some stuff on our website, the State Energy Office, but through the PACE financing program, through some of the local units of government, some of the utility programs, of course, all of them have made commitments to increase the energy efficiency programs up to, I think, almost 2% for our large investor-owned utilities now. So I think we're going to continue to see kind of larger investments from them. But I think we still need more in this area.
Excellent. Got a bunch of water questions, of course, kind of on various things, everything from, pumping water from, like the Nestle plants, using it for growing crops for animals as well as animal stock themselves. And wondering, Dr. Overpeck, if you have any comments on and James maybe as well on what are some of these bigger water issues? We talk about energy efficiency on the electric side, water efficiency, and we're using just an incredible amount of these aquifers, like you mentioned. What are some really some key takeaways that to change some of these water use habits and some of the infrastructure we need to make that happen? Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
I know James knows a lot about this and is closer to the decision making in the state. My own sense of the Great Lakes and diverting that water to, say, other parts of the country at this point is not on the table. People are really worried about losing some of this water. The Great Lakes, even though there's a lot of water in it, the water balance is such that we'd see big decreases in the levels of the lakes. Now, right now the lakes are high, and it would make sense to have a mechanism to be able to reduce that water volume rather than having to lift houses and armor all the shores and everything else that's going on. So it would be wise to figure that out. But once you've created a straw from the Great Lakes to some other location, everybody and their mother is going to want to try and get that water. And it's a non-sustainable venture. As far as the bottled water is concerned, I avoid at all costs drinking bottled water, not just because of the destruction to groundwater and springs, but because of the waste of plastic. But of course, there are communities like Flint that really need it. But I think we should really reduce the use of bottled water down to just those who really need it. And we should be, one way to do that would be to charge a much more sizable surcharge, money that would go to, say, the state for the kinds of things James was talking about, for every bottle of water that we ship out of the state or that is sold, period. I think it's a travesty that we're wasting the water that way. One of the things we need to do in Michigan, the aquifers here, when you come from the West, it's a whole different problem, right? In the West, it's like lack of water. Here, the water's here, but a lot of it's polluted. So the other thing we really need to do is get a handle on the quality and the quantity of the water that's under the ground, because we will increasingly use groundwater, I think, for agriculture and other purposes. And we better start understanding that water quality now. Our aquifers are not very deep in Michigan geologically, so it is a finite resource, although it recharges much faster than out west. I don't know if that helps.
Let me just add, really quickly add I think people need to be careful. We don't want to give the impression that, climate is just going to make the lakes kind of continually fill up with water and overflow everywhere. Right. We're in a natural cycle that goes up and down. Now, what the climate impact is that we went from record lows to record highs in record time. We've never inside of 6 years went from the low to the high. But as Peter pointed out, hey, that heat comes here, nothing would stop us from reversing that course and going from a record high back to a record low in record time. So the size of the storms is getting bigger, but that doesn't mean that you will necessarily see the lakes. Now, the latest I've seen says that you probably have a modest increase maybe in lake levels over time, but you will still get the fluctuations between high and low. On the issue of water use, and I'm just going to spend a minute on a topic I could spend hours on, people know me. Michigan is the only state east of the Mississippi that has basically dedicated in-stream flow, saying, hey, humans get somewhere between 5 and 25% of the flow, and the rest of it we are going to dedicate to basically, water ecology. That has to stay in the streams. So anybody putting in a new water withdrawal permit has to get permission from the state. And once 25%, depending on the type of stream, it can be as little as 5% up to 25%. Once humans hit that number, we're not allowing any more wells in that area anymore. So we're the first state east of the Mississippi to do that. We're still learning. It's a program that needs refinement, but we are taking steps to try to make sure that we're kind of preserving the water and due to its importance in Michigan.
I have a question, and I know we've got a lot of questions, but in rebuilding a place that's been flooded, and there's going to be more and more of them all the time, there's a lot of things we can do with water to catch it, slow it down, divert it, that are being done in cities around the world. Has the state been looking into that kind of, instead of rebuilding like in floodplains, just more dwellings that are going to flood, what are the other options we could have in rebuilding as we go forward?
Yeah, obviously it's that loss of coastal wetlands in Michigan that's coming back to bite us at this point. Most of them have been developed. So where these storms would have been buffered by flowing into some coastal wetlands, those wetlands, or even inland wetlands, those wetlands aren't there anymore. So in a certain level, we're going back into some of those areas and saying, hey, let's let them revert back to a wetland area, not use them for agriculture anymore. So we've got a lot of programs on the agricultural side where that is a voluntary temporary decision. We'll pay a farmer to not plant an area, but usually those aren't permanent easements. I think a lot of people have been advocating that we move toward permanent easements to make sure that those floodplains stay floodplains. And then we can look at the maps these days and try to figure out where location-wise would they provide the greatest benefit, and making sure that those are there. But then there's other green infrastructure projects that you mentioned. How do we make sure that as much of the storm water as possible is infiltrating through our groundwater and not just hitting impervious surface and rushing into our rivers and streams?
One of the things that folks at Michigan are doing, University of Michigan too, is looking at green infrastructure, ways that we can advance stormwater, sewage water management through green infrastructure, planting rain gardens and other types of features that make it like a nice park, but when it's raining really hard, help ameliorate the flood issue. So, what's cool though is the more you think about solutions, the more ideas you get. And we just have to figure out how to do that in a serious way. Spend the money, get it done.
Great. If I could just we've got a few minutes here to kind of wrap up, and I'm hoping kind of in the mindset of solutions and moving forward, and what next, how do we deal with all these issues on our collective plates. And if I could get feedback from each of you on what gives you hope, what do you see happening right now that gives you hope that you would like to focus on or have other people focus on, or could you could use some help with, or you want to turn people on to something. What's one kind of takeaway from a hopeful kind of solution-oriented space that you could recommend to folks?
Can I give you two?
I'll start here. I mean, okay. If I look at the big automakers and the number of electrical vehicle models they're bringing to market, I think that gives me hope, because really you look at the need to reduce our fossil fuel use in that transportation sector. We've got to start giving people more choices. And again, unfortunately, they are still geared toward maybe your middle and upper income households. But as that market grows and as that market moves into ride sharing applications, I think that ability hopefully to electrify the transportation sector, we'll see movement in the next decade that gives me some hope in that area.
One thing that's connected to that, I agree, that's a great one, is the cost of green tech, meaning clean energy and electrified mobility. The costs are going way down, and they're going down very quickly. And they're making fossil fuel not just a bad, polluting, planet-destroying industry, but they're making it too expensive. So I think that's also very encouraging. And I also think it's really encouraging that you know, when people talk about the Green New Deal, it's a very political statement. But the underlying concept of Green New Deal, in other words, let's do this in a way that's fair to everyone, that builds well-paying jobs and a good living for everybody, every American. A vast majority of Americans like that idea. So I think as we move towards accelerating our transition to a clean energy or low climate change world that is just, I think the majority of Americans are going to support that. And we're seeing that even in the more recent events associated with Black racism and environmental injustices. You know, there's a lot of public support to solve these problems.
I would just say that from the viewpoint of mid-Michigan and rural Michigan, we've had a build out of renewable energy that started about a decade ago, not far from me. And people have had all those years now to look that over and see how that's working for those communities. And what we're seeing here in mid-Michigan is to the north, south, east, and west of those areas that started 10 years ago with wind turbines, we're seeing communities choose to bring more and more wind development, and now in recent years more solar into these areas. And we're actually becoming kind of a hotbed for renewable energy development here in the central part of Michigan. I was just in Isabella County 2 days ago looking at towers going up for what will be the largest wind farm in the state, but many more to come. But people should know that there's a big organized fossil fuel, organized and funded pushback against this. And if you live in a rural area, if you know someone in a rural area, if you care about rural areas, you need to get out there and help these folks, because the vast majority want this development to help them get their economies moving again. And it's happening if we want it to happen.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Yes, it is moving forward to a more just economic system, environmental system, energy systems. So we appreciate all of your times today. Thank you, James. Thank you, Dr. Overpeck. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Justin. I think it was a very engaging discussion today. I learned a lot for sure. I appreciate all of your time. There were a lot of questions, of course, we did not get to. I don't know if we'll be able to deal with that in some other fashion or not, but thank you for everyone that did comment or ask a question. We appreciate your input. And this video will be made available pretty quickly. So if you did sign up, you will get a link to this. I believe we've been doing it Facebook Live as well. So that should be available on the Groundwork Center Facebook page as well. So yeah, on behalf of the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities, we really appreciate you joining us today. Enjoy the rest of the day and take care, everybody. Be safe.